Welcome back to the channel, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you've had a wonderful week thus far. Considering how quick the turnarounds have been recently, feels like an age since I last spoke to you, but it's good to be back as always. As you can see, the rank has certainly recovered from the sizable red arrow it used to be, only now down to 207k, thanks to a Ryan Nori assist and a Jared Bowen haul. So very nice of him to repay my faith in the selection. Today, I have a lot for you. We will be talking about the mystery chip and my positive reflection on it, which certainly seems to be unpopular within the community. We'll be talking about captaincy and taking a deep dive there. We will also be looking at the forwards, whether you should sell or keep Matthias Cunha, whether Isak is essential, midfielder replacements, both for the cheaper guys in terms of Enzo Fernandez potentially, and should we sell Brian and Bruno, and a whole host of other things, including the defense. Before we start, for the 40.3% of you who watch regularly but have not subscribed, if you just check if you have or have not, and then could press the button should you not have done so, I would be greatly appreciative. And for those of you who are new around here, I hope you enjoy the video. And for those of you who are new around here, do subscribe to make sure you don't miss out on any essential content. Without anything else needing to be said, let's hop into a video that I think could be quite interesting. I thought it appropriate to relegate the captaincy section to second place, considering we have finally had the reveal of the mystery ship, albeit out of absolutely nowhere. I certainly wasn't expecting it so early in the month. I personally really like it. I think this will be a chip that is very much skill-based relative to the rest of the game. Not to say the rest of the game isn't, but there's more elements of luck involved, I would say. Now, for those of you who haven't found out what it is, I'll give you a quick rundown. Okay, we are going to get a manager for 3 game weeks, in 3 consecutive game weeks, and in that time, you cannot use any other chip either. They will score 6 points for a win, 3 for a draw, and then 1 point for every goal their team scores, and 1 point for every clean sheet they keep. Within that 3 game week period, you will select a manager who ranges in price between 0.5 and 1.5 million. And if you want to shift them, for example, to another manager for the next week, you will have to use your usual free transfers. And to even use a chip in the first place in a way it's actually effective, you must take the money out of your squad and use it in the manager. So it makes squads with Haaland, for example, far less desirable, I would say. Even from a standpoint prior to Game Week 24, which is the first time you can use it, in terms of setting it up, it's just going to make it significantly more difficult. Now, the reason I see so much upside to this play is because of the rule that you will get an extra 10 points if you pick a manager's team who are 5 places below the one they are going to play and they win, right? So that means 16 points for a win or 8 points for a draw because you get an extra 5 points. As an example, let's take Game Week 25 potentially, where Everton and Liverpool might double. Everton will have Liverpool at home, and they will also have Palace away. If I back Sean Dyche to do pretty well there, and Palace, for example, are cruising, then I could generate, let's say they get 1 win and 1 draw, 24 points from the results alone in those 2 weeks. That would just be 1 gaming, sorry, from those 2 games alone, and an extra point for the goals they score, and if they manage to keep a clean sheet. That's a lot. However, on the flip side, I won't be able to then triple captain Mohammed Salah, okay? That's a big loss, I would say, especially when other people are going to do so. So the swings will be huge, determined by where you find yourself on which side of the fence. And in general, let's say you do that for Sean Dyche. Well, the next week, maybe Man United are significantly lower than another side, but they're at home and you think they'll beat them. Okay, you then buy Ruben Amorim and he wins. That's another 16 points. Then you do that the next week after. So the upside to the chip with the extra 10 points for the gaps between the teams is huge. And I'm considering playing it in a way whereby I target the lower teams instead of even prioritizing, let's say, a Liverpool or a City side that I expect to win 5-0, who would get 6 points for the win, 5 points for the 5 goals, which is 11, plus 1 for the clean sheet. That would be 12 points, but I'm really going to look to maximize my upside to the biggest possible extent. So those are my early thoughts with regards to the mystery chip. I'm going to be slightly cautious now with free transfers because I want to play aggressive around that time, maybe even getting players from the manager's team that I'm selecting and going from there. But yeah, very interesting. And I'm looking forward to it because I think it will create a diversification of strategy, that's for sure. Now we locate back to captaincy, and I have 3 candidates for you this week: Mohammed Salah, Cole Palmer, and Bukayo Saka. Surprise, surprise, surprise. However, as you will see on the next slide, I'm not so bullish on Bukayo this week. We won't be going for a hat-trick of differential captain returns from him, which means I see it mainly as a toss-up and a duel straight between Salah and Palmer. We'll start with a counter-argument for Salah, and then I will present the other side of the argument. Fulham's hybrid 4-4-2, 5-4-1, which has come into fashion recently, I would say more recently, and early in the season, it was a lot more strict 4-4-2, has been very tough to break down. Initially, it's a 4-4-2 mid block, which transitions into a 5-4-1 low block with Iwobi dropping in many, many cases. Marco Silva's definitely shown himself to be one of the better off-the-ball coaches this year. And there's a number of things which have demonstrated that. For example, the spacing between the lines is really good, right? You see sides who are not as compact in their block, but he certainly does not have that issue. The Brighton game is a good example. Even when Matt O'Reilly and Matoma found themselves between the lines, given the spacing, it was far easier for his players to close them down when they were in there. And thus, let's take Matt O'Reilly's performance, for example. A good player, but someone who really struggled to create anything threatening from those situations because the time offered was so short, and we've got the level of physicality to deal with on Fulham's side, which we will discuss. Now, with regards to Liverpool, their midfield is not one which is composed of what I would say are low block slayers, particularly when you look at their attacking eight being either Jones or Szoboszlai. I think both serve as better assets to their side in games which are slightly more transitional in nature. And there's also no Alexis McAllister, which we'll come on to later. So I imagine they both play together. Okay, so that's the first thing that I like to discuss. The second variable to discuss is what was touched on earlier and has been touched on many a time on this channel throughout the season, and that is the level of physicality that Fulham boast. I will give you an example for you to visualize and to help understand it better. And from there, I think you can just apply it generally to pretty much every context. Against Everton, when Jack Harrison was receiving the ball and the touch was even slightly loose, Robinson could leverage the explosivity he had over Harrison to almost enter his space and make it significantly more difficult for him to keep the ball. It means that Harrison would have to go back. It means that when they were shoulder to shoulder, Robinson's more likely to take the ball and win it from him. And it means that even penetrating the space in behind is significantly more difficult. So the options he has are significantly reduced. So every time he gets the ball, it has to be that much more precise to ensure that Robinson can't leverage all of those physical traits to getting one up on him and winning the one-on-one / duel in any capacity. Now, Fulham boast this, right? They boast this level of physicality. So Liverpool are going to have to be on it on the day. Now, there are days where you can not be on it as such, especially when Salah is at times, and get away with it with a little moment of magic here and there. But that is significantly harder to do when the level of physicality is potentially not going to drop, right? And when I say not going to drop, obviously it's going to drop throughout the game because players get tired. But I mean to an extent whereby that level of magic maybe probably doesn't have the same effect as it does in other games. Robinson versus Salah, in particular, that duel is not going to be one that's easy for him. It'll definitely be one of his harder opponents that he faced. Look how aggressive he was against Saka, and look how good of a job he did against Saka, right? And I expect him to do something similar in fashion to Mohammed Salah. Now, what is really interesting is one performance that I've kept replaying in my mind this year, and I really wish that other teams would adopt, specifically against Liverpool and Mohammed Salah. Look what Nottingham Forest did. They took out both their wingers, and they made it much more difficult for Liverpool to beat them with the inclusion of far more athletic and defensively based profiles within their midfield, right? And just natural centre midfielders. And the other thing was, look what Alex Moreno did compared to other fullbacks in the league this season. He was really aggressive, right? And I think that is the best way to approach a winger like Mohamed Salah. Okay, fine. If he just rips you and he beats you 1v1, then so be it. At least you still have cover given how wide he's starting, right? But to allow for that separation, which Moreno did a few times, just means that his killer creative actions can come into play. And that happened. There was one time where Moreno dropped off him and Salah played a lovely outside of the foot pass, and it really could have hurt them, right? And that happened a couple of times, and Murillo berated him once after. But when he didn't, when he was more aggressive, he did really well. And I think Robinson will take a similar approach. So I wouldn't be surprised to see Salah have one of his harder games. Now, the other thing is there's no McAllister. So I think in terms of build-up, and I think in terms of being between the lines against this type of block, you would probably rather have someone like Alexis McAllister as opposed to Jones and Szoboszlai. So there is that. Now I shall present the counters to the counter argument. There's no Calvin Bassey and there's no Joachim Andersen. That is a huge loss. That's their two best centre-backs out, and the physical level that I've spoken about, there's certainly going to be a drop-off from there. The other thing is, this Liverpool side are able to mitigate against transition so much better than the Jurgen Klopp Liverpool side were for the structure that they use and for the philosophy that Arne Slot has put into these performances. For example, the smaller spacing between players, hence reduced distance for passes, which means you're less likely to lose the ball and therefore less turnovers, less transition, etc., etc., right? The fullback's narrower, so on transition, your centre-backs aren't going to get dragged as much to pivot in front, etc., right? Fulham in general, anyway, I wouldn't say are a side that boasts too much transitional threat, especially when they're going to be deeper anyway. Outside of Adama Traore and Anthony Robinson, who's a fullback anyway, I wouldn't say it's really there. I don't think Jimenez should cause Van Dijk and Gomez too many problems. And Emil Smith-Rowe is getting up to speed, I would say, every game, increasing in his level of athleticism, but still isn't a monster in that sense, or what he used to be, in my personal opinion, following his injury. So the waves of pressure that Liverpool are able to sustain should be very consistent, and it's a lot of pressure to absorb. Then you consider the fact that who have they got maybe in their creative department to destroy these type of really aggressive, well-structured, well-set mid and low blocks? Well, they've got Trent and Salah, arguably, not even arguably, the best right side you could probably have in the world right now. And that's enough for me. That is enough for them to get over the line. So I'm expecting Liverpool to eventually break through. The question remains, however, if Salah has to remain pretty wide, is he going to be the one on the end of it? And in general, when do they break through? Whilst I'm expecting it to happen, if it doesn't happen early in the game, then it could only be like a 1 or a 2 goal win. And personally, I have a strong preference for my wingers to play narrower against back fives, but I'm not necessarily too expectant of this happening, especially considering the lesser nature of Trent's overlaps this year. It's very difficult because I think there are a lot of tactical elements which suggest you shouldn't, a lot of tactical elements which suggest you should. And of course, we are dealing with probably the best player in the world at the moment, who's on penalties as well, which is a pretty big deal. So for me, I just wanted to present the argument to you, and we'll talk about the rankings a little bit more once I've discussed Cole Palmer. I would say the Fulham game is slightly easier to call in terms of what we're expecting in terms of the two lineups, the structures, the formations, etc. However, this one, I would say, is quite the opposite. I have little idea as to how Thomas Frank would set up. As you've seen, there are so many structures there which you could use on and off the ball, and I'm not sure exactly which one he will use, and I don't really want to try and guess one. I wouldn't say I'm particularly well informed on this subject. However, one thing I do know is that he has many weapons, and in general, he tends to favour an aggressive style of football, especially nowadays, and I imagine a high press will be something that he selects for the reasons that, one, his team's very good at it, two, I think from what I've seen in his interviews, he's certainly taken a liking to it in terms of its not only utility within games, but also from a philosophical standpoint. And when you look at how we build, right, we invite that pressure. We allowed Spurs to press that high. It's not like we were going long super often. And then we were playing through them, right? So we'll probably try to do the same against Brentford. Okay. So given that, I think you'll see a game which is, again, in a somewhat similar fashion to the Spurs game, a game where there should be a lot of goals on offer. It should be pretty heavy in terms of transitions, and it will have a basketball nature to it. Now, I think we're capable of playing out of a high press. When you look at our second half performance with Lee Wyckover, who's very, very good in that central centre-back role in terms of build-up, Benio Badiashile on his preferred side on the left, and then Malagusto very, very, very competent on the ball, hence why he's able to play in those midfield pockets and do so well. I think we should be able to play out their press. And when we do so, and when we turn them over, that's where we can be so devastating with the creatives we have and the runners and the physical profiles within the side. In general as well, I think they'll take quite an aggressive approach, even when we're higher up the pitch. And I can see Cole Palmer definitely occupying pockets of space that are probably larger compared to what he's used to, especially how teams have been playing against him recently. On the flip side, right, one thing with Palmer, even though he's just coming off the back of an 18-pointer, even though a couple games ago some of you captained him for his 14-pointer against Villa, I would say his particular goal threat hasn't really been there as of late, and for a while now. Against Spurs, yeah, sure, he got 2 penalties, but apart from the one where he fluffed his lines when the ball went through his legs, his direct goal threat and the positions he was getting himself into weren't really the ones where you would be expecting of him to score a huge number of goals. And I think that's definitely something to consider. I would say this is a different game compared to pretty much what you're going to get in general. And that's slightly better for him. But I think that deserves some consideration. Also, in those bigger games, I think it makes a lot more sense to go for a more standard 3-2-2-3. Obviously, in the second half, we saw Cucurella inverting all the way, and then Enzo dropping deeper. So it was at times like a 3-2-2-3 with Cucurella pushed on and Enzo in the pivot. Sometimes it was more like a 3-1-3-3. And we had variations of that. And Enzo Maresca's tactical flexibility has been fantastic this year, but not all of them are going to serve Palmer in the best way possible. And you would prefer him in that right half space more and more. Okay. Then you look at Brentford's home and away form. Obviously, significantly worse away, and they've been conceding goals. I also don't think they're the same type of defensive side they used to be. They used to be super compact and hard to beat. It's one of the reasons that Haaland definitely struggled against them early on when he came to the league in terms of his output compared to the rest of the sides. But I would say they've abandoned that somewhat in pursuit of a brand of football and a style of football which accesses a higher ceiling. So I think there's definitely going to be goals on offer. Now, with that all being said, it makes it very difficult to justify either Salah or Palmer. But for me, given I know, or not know, given I expect a more open game at Stamford Bridge, I'm personally going to go for Cole Palmer purely for that reason. The conditions are there for Fulham to make it super difficult, whereby I don't think Brentford will be able to make it as difficult for Chelsea and limit the volume of attacks or the quality of attacks as much as Fulham can potentially do. And for that reason, I'm going to go for Cole Palmer. The reason I concluded that before touching on Bukayo Saka is I find it very difficult to justify him. One, Everton have had a rest and picked up some form, I guess you could say, following their 4-0 victory. And the other thing is, one, Yuri Timber might not even be fit. But if he is, what if he plays at left back again? I think the right-hand side dynamics have come, well, they were significantly worse without him against Fulham. And it's a Sean Dyche Everton, right? It's a Sean Dyche side. On their day, super difficult to beat. And when you have Palmer with the condition presented and you have Salah in the form he is, I'm preferring just to go for one of those two. And in my case, it will be Cole Palmer, 99% likely. That was without doubt one of the more difficult captaincy sections that I had this season, given the number of unknowns, but I hope it was helpful. Now, moving on to Enzo Fernandez, from the right centre mid at Chelsea to the left centre mid as of late. Strikers tend to score goals that they will replicate. For example, imagine your most creative player is on the right-hand side and you often make the run from the centre into that right inside channel and strike across the goalkeeper to score with your right foot, okay? Maybe you do that quite a few times in the season. Maybe you play a lot of teams that boast a high line and you're quick and you exploit that space in behind and you find yourself one-on-one with the keeper a lot and you finish it. Enzo Fernandez, however, has scored 3 goals, which I think are pretty difficult for him to replicate. And I'm going to show you 3 still images and we can talk through all of them very quickly. Here is the goal against Spurs. First of all, he finds himself in the box, which he may not do so at times or particularly often for reasons we will discuss shortly. And it is a brilliant left-footed strike, which is rifled past Fraser Forster. I put emphasis on the fact that it was his left foot, okay? Because he's not left-footed. So how often is he going to score this type of goal? How replicable is it? For me, I'm not sure that it's going to be replicable too often, given how good of a goal it was. I then move on to another goal that he scored, where he followed up a brilliant save from Hermansen following a Nicholas Jackson header to head the ball in for himself within the 6-yard box. How often is Enzo going to be scoring this type of goal? Well, he's not traditionally a box crasher or someone who arrives in the box, I would say, at a high frequency. So scoring this type of goal, I wouldn't say is something that's particularly replicable, nor is he the type of player to really be scoring headers either. So that's, again, something to note. Lastly, this is just a brilliant finish again, right? Pretty much with the outside of his foot, rifled into the corner. And like I said, a top finish. Is he the player who's demonstrated brilliant ball striking from a medium type of distance such as this, and one who's going to score these type of goals often? I would not say in his career so far he's shown that he's this type of player. So again, some food for thought. So given the 3 examples I've displayed, I am somewhat cautious of saying that, oh, this is a guy who will now be able to generate goals and assists, because I am not seeing goals that I think are ones that he can replicate particularly easily, right? So that's that. In terms of his positioning in general, he isn't a box crasher, as I explained earlier. And in terms of his role from left centre mid, he's not someone who has a Gundo type of role from left centre mid where he was making those third-man runs and you really expected him to score. Also, he's traditionally a deep-lying playmaker. As you saw against Spurs, he will definitely be able to move into the pivot because that is probably his best position, albeit he's been fantastic this year in terms of his upturn in form and the way he's transformed himself. And I've been so impressed, right? So that all needs to be taken into account. He also effectively blocks Jackson, who we're going to speak about in the next section. And I would say with the fixtures and the structures of teams at the moment and what you could deem to be the optimal structure, you'd probably prefer to have Nico. You could argue you could have Cole, Nico, and Enzo, but I think triple Chelsea is a little bit overkill, especially considering the asset that you're buying here. Now, what is the counter argument? Well, one, the fixtures just are very good for quite a long period of time. Two, he's dirt cheap at 5 million, right? And some of you probably picked him up at 4.9 before the price rise as well, albeit I imagine not too many. So he acts as a wonderful facilitator for the rest of his squad. And when the managers come into play with the new mystery chip being revealed, he's also got set pieces in terms of corners from that left-hand side. At times, I've seen Palmer take it from there once, but in general, I imagine it's Enzo. And he's just a quality footballer, okay? For me, however, I'm going to lean on the fence of saying no. Not just because of what I think he can do. I wouldn't be surprised if he continues to rack up returns. And on average, his points per game is someone who is reflective of having a decent floor as opposed to a ceiling. I really don't think his ceiling is going to be there over the long run. But my biggest caveat is his competition, and not so much Amad Diallo. I think Amad Diallo is okay. He's cool. He's, again, very, very cheap. But having a wing back, again, is the ceiling really there? No. And I want to put myself in a position where at least I'm exposing myself to potential upside. And I feel like the person who does that best is Morgan Rogers. Okay, fine, he's 0.4 more expensive than Enzo Fernandez, and I was willing to go up to 5.5. But a lot of you would have bought him earlier, so he's really like 0.1, 0.2 more expensive for you. Unai Emery loves him. So I think in terms of the minutes, he should be absolutely fine. Fine, he won't play 90 every game. He can't with the intensity of the Villa schedule, considering they've got the Champions League as well. But he'll play a lot of minutes. And for example, I wouldn't have been overly surprised if he was benched against Southampton. But he plays every single minute there after playing 86 midweek. So you can see how much he's trusted by the manager and how robust his body currently is. And the fixtures from 19 are really good. And I would say someone like him, he's just a better attacker than Enzo Fernandez. Is he a better player? No, not currently. But he's a better attacker. And for those reasons, I think the ceiling and the upside is far more accessible to yourself. Personally, I prefer Morgan Rogers to Enzo Fernandez, but I understand why you would go for Enzo, particularly relating to the floor over a set of games. And I think that's the main standout point for him, but I think there's enough to justify going Morgan Rogers for what I've presented. It seems like this section is an ever-present and constantly needs to be revisited week on week on week. Bye-bye Bruno and Brian. We will start with what I have always said, in my opinion, is the easier one, and that is Bruno Fernandes, coming off a 9-pointer for owners. With regards to Man United, this is my personal view. This season, I'm not bullish, and I think they're going to struggle. Physically and technically, in terms of their profiles, I do not think they are ones as a collective which are particularly well suited to Ruben Amorim's system. I think one, in terms of the physical profiles, you just need a lot more, right? They just need to be better, stronger, quicker, faster, more athletic, right? In terms of the technical side of it, I would say that the profiles he has within the players he can play at 10 in his 210s, combined with the pivot, is not particularly well suited, again, to his style of football nor the league at the moment. So given I'm not overly bullish on United's performances, given I think Bruno could play in the pivot at times, given that even if he does play in the 10, I think outside of Højlund, he isn't going to be able to leverage his creative capabilities to an extent where there's a huge likelihood of him generating output consistently, I would say, and his price, I would say this is the time to go. The fixtures aren't too bad. In like Manchester City is probably a good time to play them. And one thing that they'll be happy about is that they'll actually be able to transition on City and it won't be too difficult in that regard. Then you've got Bournemouth after, who I think are a really good stylistic fit for Man United. I actually think one of the best ways to play against Man United is not to press them high, and Bournemouth will undoubtedly press them high, and not to give them space in behind. And if you don't do that, I think they'll really struggle against a lot of teams. But Bournemouth aren't going to really do either of those things. And then it's Wolves the week after, who knows where they'll be by that standpoint, right? So for me, I think it's a pretty easy sell, and we've got the replacements there, which we're going to move on to. Brian Mbuemo is, again, more difficult, right? You see the quality on display with the goal he scores against Newcastle, and he's just coming off the back of a 13-point. I would say this is a problem or a challenge or a situation of quality versus volume. The quality that I've just discussed, and we've all seen showcased throughout this season by himself. But Thomas Frank spoke in an interview about how one of the things he loved about Brian Mbuemo's game against Newcastle was his work rate. Now, that's great if you're a Brentford fan, if you're Thomas Frank, or you just care about Brentford winning. But from an FPL manager standpoint, that's not what you want from your midfielder. You want him to ideally be as lazy as possible and just sit around the goal all day and just put him in when they get in those areas, right? And all of his iterations, I would say, involve width, right? Significant width, which Brian Mbuemo is occupying, whether that be in almost a wing back type of role at times, or in a 4-2-4 where he's playing on that right side. And you've got Sharda and Whistler in the middle, or Thiago and Whistler in the middle with Lewis Potter providing the width off the left, right? So for me, personally, I'm going to say that with regards to the volume that he's going to accumulate in games in terms of chances and opportunities to return, it shouldn't be too high. I would say, however, obviously, I mentioned the quality, but the fixtures aren't even too bad. Even when he gets to the run of Manchester City and Liverpool at home, given they're both at home, I think they're okay given Brentford's form there and the type of player he is. I also think Chelsea are a side, as Spurs showed, that there's definitely goals to be had against there. They've got Forest at home, which is much better than having them away. Brighton, again, similar to Chelsea, they give you a chance, albeit in a different fashion. So I'm not as against holding him as I previously was, because I did see a lot of upside associated to the first 2 games of Jared Bowen's fixtures. And if you wanted to keep him, I'm fine with it now. I thought there was a lot of upside to be had in Bowen's last 2 fixtures. He essentially goes blow for blow with Mbuemo finishing 1 point below, but you get to keep some value given Mbuemo's price dropped. But now I would say is a much easier hold. In terms of the replacement, should you wish to do so, Bowen, again, I think for the fact that he's Bowen, right? And I spoke about that so many times in terms of what that means and how he's just so secure as an asset. For me, I prefer him at right wing compared to 9 because on the assumption he's a 9 and Kudus plays on the right, he's the main creative outlet. And I think the balls that get played into him for his chances are in that right-hand side channel, and he has to strike across a lot with his right foot. And what I've seen is there might be a slight finishing deficiency with his right foot, especially compared to the left. He's also not really able to leverage that left foot in terms of cutting in and utilizing the angle where he scored the goal against Wolves. And hence why I prefer him right wing. However, for reasons I've discussed prior, I think the central players against Bournemouth are the ones to have. So if he is to play at 9, then Danny Ings is to be on the bench again. I think that's good. And then from there on, I would hope that he reverts to the right wing position. So I think decent upside in the short term. Gordon and Eze as a combination. And I say as a combination because the fixtures are absolutely wonderful. Or at least they appear to be. Leicester, Ipswich, Villa at home, which I think is really good for Anthony Gordon. And then Eze in 19 has Southampton at home, and then you kind of keep him from there. What I would say, however, is there's risk associated to this strategy, more so than with someone like Bowen, because Gordon at the moment hasn't shown his expected minutes to be fantastic. He's had his rest, which is a good thing, but in general, he's been getting hooked far earlier than he used to last season. And in games which aren't heavy transition based, Newcastle have definitely had issues with their creative dynamics, which we go on to discuss in the Isak section. So in terms of the accumulation of chances that he's going to get or even be able to create for assists, I'm not sure they're particularly high. Again, I will talk about Leicester in the next section, but I was actually pretty impressed by what I saw against Brighton for a number of reasons. And therefore, I wouldn't be surprised if the game's slightly harder than maybe some think. And the other thing is they're more expensive than some of the other options, such as Kudus, Semenyo, Iwobi/ESR, and Morgan Gibbs-White, which we'll touch on. Kudus would essentially be the cheap version of Owen. I think he has worse fundamentals. For me, a better player. He's a top player, in my opinion. I rate Bowen, but I just think Kudus is top. But he comes in significantly cheaper, and I think the expected minutes will be pretty solid. He's too good to be on the bench for more than 20 minutes, I would say. So I'm pretty comfortable in his expected minutes, and I think at that price, he could actually be a very secure option, especially if you didn't favor someone like Semenyo, right? Because one of the main arguments people have said is that on transition, he's not really been there. He's not really been arriving. And in general, he's playing a little bit deeper as to what you would like. The other thing is he's definitely not the best finisher in the world. So if you wanted to go elsewhere, considering that some of the better fixtures have gone, I still think there are a few good ones coming up. I don't mind it. But again, you have to remember that he is so cheap. He is facilitating other things. For me, I still stand by the optimal structure being one cheap midfielder and then having one of the more expensive ones, whether that be Bowen and then Gordon and Eze as a combination from 16 to 18 and then 19 onwards. So I think you could fade, but I wouldn't say he's a sell yet. The other thing is against Ipswich, Iraola spoke about how they were definitely going to be tired given the short turnaround. So you have to account for that. At least they've had a lot more rest. Now, Fulham's fixtures swing, which means there are a lot more upside attached to options such as Iwobi and ESR. I have my concerns over ESR's expected minutes. I quite like the pairing of Lukic and Sander Berge as well, I guess a defensive duo within the midfield. And then Andreas Pereira probably takes minutes of Emil Smith Rowe, right? So that's something to consider. And as I discussed, I prefer a structure with one cheap midfielder. Iwobi, I would say, is better for expected minutes, especially given his form. But for me, I'm not sure how sustainable the level of output is. I would probably be preferring a Semenyo in this type of situation. But like I said, ideally neither, because you have Morgan Rogers who exists. Morgan Gibbs White, I just think will do well in the next 3 games. So if any of you fancy the differential, I think from a stylistic standpoint, it's pretty decent. I think he's got some catching up to do in terms of output, especially compared to the last 2 years. So if any of you did fancy it, I wouldn't mind a Morgan Gibbs White punt. Similar to Bye Bye Bruno and Brian, this seems to be a section that can never just rest for 1 week, and we always have to revisit it. Should you be sticking with Matthias Cunha? My issue with him has been the same issue I've had with him throughout the campaign, and why I am yet to select him in one of my teams. And that is with the greatest respect. I do mean that. The players around him. The final João Gomez action in the first half was unbelievable. And Cunha was so annoyed at it. He even threw his arms up in the air. And rightfully so. They were on the counter-attack, or as a transition, I can't remember. And João Gomez really should have played him in when he was running that left channel. And Cunha potentially could have found himself one-on-one should he get past the defender. But he didn't. He stopped, and he turned around, and the whistle blows. And it's that type of quality that's lacking, which means that the conditions for Cunha to return consistently, I would say, are lacking, right? And you can't expect him to consistently score absolute screamers from outside the block box, or bring down balls out of the sky and then just finish them beautifully as well, right? So that's that. I also don't think Leicester and Ipswich are as good, or Ipswich and Leicester in this case are as good as people say. Ipswich, I wouldn't be surprised if everything were to be analysed and people would say they were a better team. I don't think I would necessarily disagree. Davis, Muric, Amari Hutchinson, even Delap, what McKenna's doing, I quite like it, right? And there was a stat on Match of the Day that they've actually dropped more points than anyone else from winning positions. So they've shown the capabilities to impose themselves within games and start really strong. It's just about whether they can finish and be a little bit more compact, I feel like, and a little bit more street smart. But if they are, I think Wolves could struggle again, potentially. And Leicester's off-the-ball performance against Brighton really impressed me. And let's touch on this now, because if people are going to target them, then they should know what they're in for. Brighton played with a formation that I really, really liked. It was almost like a pyramid/diamond in the middle with, as opposed to the wingers being super wide, Mitoma and Ruta played very narrow, and the small space combinations available to João Pedro, Mitoma, Ruta, and Evan Ferguson were there in abundance given the close proximity of the players. And then they pushed Tariq Lamptey and Estepinian on wide and high to create that width, and the block can't just be super narrow and therefore compact. But Leicester still managed to maintain a pretty compact block. And I was really impressed by that. So I don't think in terms of creating chances against them, it will be as easy as it has been in the past. And also because they're not going to be as quote-unquote negative/defensive as they were under Steve Cooper, you can't sustain waves of pressure as well as you could have done previously. So that's just a few things to know. I really don't mind selling for Alexander Isak. I trust Newcastle a lot more. And I also think he's a better hold for 18 with the fixture of Villa at home. I really like that for him and Gordon. And then from there, a nice easy route into Mateta in Game Week 19, who we will speak about. Jackson was visibly very upset on the bench after being substituted. Now, people have been speaking about, is this an injury? Personally, I don't think so. I think he was just upset at his performance. And I bring this up because I wouldn't be so bearish on him now that he's had one bad game, right? He's been very, very good this season. So with the fixture run coming up, I would definitely look at it with a more bullish standpoint than bearish, even if his performance against Spurs wasn't great and he got benched against Southampton. 17, 18, 20, however, I don't think are the best from a stylistic perspective. I prefer the others. So that is something to consider if you would like to go without. For me, however, with the quality of opposition that he faces with respect to Chelsea, with the utmost respect to all of those oppositions, I do think over a long term, he's a pretty easy set and forget when you consider what we're going to have to deal with in weeks coming with the assistant manager chip, the chips that we'll have to play, double game weeks, blank game weeks, etc. I think having a set structure and some players as long-term holds really will suit you well. Do you need Alexander Isak? I wouldn't say you need him because Newcastle haven't displayed a level of creativity against certain types of defensive structures, which has been one that suggests Isak is going to go parabolic against pretty much every opposition. But the fixtures in the next three are pretty good. He provides a wonderful exit route into Mateta, who I think looked very sharp as of late in 19. And is there anyone with more upside than him in the short term? No, probably not. So I would say that it's preferable to have him, but not essential given the creative dynamics Newcastle have boasted so far. The other thing is against Brentford, Bruno G definitely played a little bit higher up than he was used to doing so for this side, and I think that's a good thing because I think he is someone who has a wide variety in terms of his skill set, and one of those involves being such a brilliant creative passer. So I think that's good for Isak. Wisser and Wood, I would happily keep both. If you're in a situation where transfers are not there in abundance, or there is more efficient usage of them elsewhere, or there's fires that need to be put out, I would more than happily keep them. I like the fixture run over a medium term. They're both in really good form. The fundamentals for them are really solid as well. And yeah, I just have a lot of good things to say about them. And they're pretty cheap, so they act as facilitators. Where does Kai Havertz fit into all of this? I actually think the fixtures are pretty good for him, especially like Brentford away, Brighton away, with his ability to exploit space behind the last line, and the fact that Everton, Arsenal won't have to come up against the meanest and well-structured low blocks, because neither of them would likely play that. That's good for him. I think the volume of chances he's had in those type of games have been particularly low. I wouldn't say he's looked particularly threatening as of late, and for that reason, I think where high ceilings exist for other players, it's an unnecessary risk to take right now. Let him find some form, and then if he does, by all means, go and get him. And when Arsenal and himself looks a little bit more dangerous, but for now, I think it's a risk that doesn't really need to be taken. Finally, we finished with the defenders. People are looking to bring in Virgil van Dijk or Trent Alexander-Arnold. Personally, I prefer Van Dijk. I think 0.6 is quite a bit when you think about it in the current state of the game. That is, after all, the price you could pay for a manager. Trent's role this year really hasn't been one which is suggestive of anywhere close to the output level he used to produce, albeit it's still there, right? And there's so many positives associated to Trent, not only in terms of clean sheets, but going forward, even within this role. But I think when you consider the fact that there's 0.6 million in it, the expected minutes, not only in terms of starts, but also being subbed off early, which take away from his potential opportunities to return, the opportunity cost of that £7 million price tag, and Van Dijk's goal threat from corners has definitely looked good. I personally prefer the Dutchman, but I don't think anyone could say it's a bad selection to go Trent, especially if you're bullish on some of the cheaper assets in the midfield and forward line. Alisson, I'm more open to it than I usually am with regards to more expensive keepers. I still prefer to go for one of the cheaper keepers, especially given the fixture swings that Palace and Fulham are going to see, and the defensive nature of Nottingham Forest, albeit they're slightly shifted, and the Chelsea fixture on at the moment. But I'm more open to it given he's not too expensive, and Liverpool's defenses look magnificent, and I really, really do like the fixtures from a defensive standpoint. Arsenal, well, you can't really be picking Yuri Timber if he's not fit, and you probably won't find out. So do you want to take that risk? And even if he is fit, I imagine he won't be 100%, maybe 90%, but not 100%. No, very rarely is a player 100% fit nowadays. So you've always got the potential reoccurrence of an injury, and that becoming a headache down the line. I don't think the fixtures are all of that. For example, okay, fine, Everton at home, Ipswich at home is good, but Palace away, sandwiched in between that, I wouldn't say so. And then Brentford away, Brighton away, and then the fixture on toughens. Again, not so confident in it. I think just Gvardiol and leaving it is probably optimal, in my opinion, given how things have changed. Gvardiol, I think, would be far more attractive if they didn't have so many injuries. He probably plays left centre-back more now, which means that he's not going to be able to get into those attacking positions that he had done so previously. The other thing is Gundo seems to be playing at the base quite consistently, and I don't think that makes them particularly transition-proof, so the likelihood of them conceding goals will be there. So I'd say this is a reassess in 18 for those looking to potentially bring him in if things change with the fixture swing. But for now, I really don't mind selling if you have a view which is that you're not going to bring him back in and you would rather redistribute the funds elsewhere. In terms of the cheaper defenders, I think, for example, Lewis Hall and Ryan Aït-Nouri have great fixtures in the short term. But for those long-term holds, Munoz and Robinson, when their fixtures swing, are great, especially with the attacking upside they pose. Levi Colwood's not too bad either. So if you can wait to get a Munoz and Robinson, I would absolutely do so. A lot of you probably have at least one of Aït-Nouri or Hall anyway, and then an Arsenal or Liverpool defender. So I think in terms of defensive structure, they should largely be fine for the next few weeks. and then you can reassess after that. And there are potential options both in the expensive category and in the cheaper category. And that is all she wrote for today, ladies and gentlemen. A lot of effort went into that video, so I hope you did enjoy it. If you did, do like the video and consider subscribing if you have not done so already. I shall see you tomorrow for team selection. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments. But until then, have a great day and goodbye.